Hello viewers, and welcome to the very first LOTR LCG card review by the 10th Nazgul. My name is Mitch, and tonight's topic is the Blood of Gondor. Joining me on the progression series, as always, is Matthew, if you'd like to say hello.
Greetings, everyone.
And why don't we get started?
Alright, the hero of this adventure pack is Caldara. She has a threat cost of 8, 2 willpower, 1 attack strength, 2 defense strength, and 3 hit points. She is a Gondor hero, and her action reads, discard Caldara to put 1 spirit ally from your discard pile into play for each other hero you control with a printed spirit resource icon. So, Mitch, when we were at Gen Con, this was a pack that we got to pick up early, and in FFG's display case, we got to see her spoiled before we actually got to pick up the pack. And so, I think I took pictures of it, we posted it in various places, COTR's webpage, I believe, or Facebook page, and a lot of people were really disappointed or really curious or like, oh, this is an interesting hero, not at all what we expected. I have to admit that she's not one that I've played with. But certainly, she's pushing the monosphere sub-theme of this particular cycle. I think I've got 2 major thoughts, and I'll start with my plus for her. There aren't that many Gondor heroes in the game. If I've counted correctly, there are 8, and 2 versions of Boromir, and then other different ones. And there's only a few that have willpower greater than 1. Faramir from Assault on Osgiliath has 2. Prince Imrahil back from A Journey to Rosgobel has 2. And so Caldara is the only other hero that we have for Gondor that has 2 willpower, and she's the only Spirit Gondor hero that has 2 willpower. So that, I think, is a positive. Her threat value is relatively low, certainly compared with Boromir or Faramir or Prince Imrahil. The weakness, though, I think, of this particular card is that I'm not sure at this point in the game if there are that many spirit allies that I would need in a pinch. I'm assuming that most of the time when you trigger her ability, it's going to be sort of a last-ditch effort to win the quest that particular turn, or maybe even the next turn. And so to lose a hero, to potentially lose a round of resources, to get into play 2 allies, I'm not sure what allies would be worth putting in from the Spirit Sphere at this point. Certainly as the card pool grows, I think Caldara is one of those types of heroes that could potentially get better and better and better. As of right now, having not played with her, certainly, for me, the jury is still out.
Well, I'll start off by saying I think there's definitely probably a good reason that you haven't used this hero. She's a relatively hardy questing character, and the 2 willpower is nice, but that's really all that she's doing. Her ability requires that you discard a hero, and to me, it just seems like she's so dedicated to questing, she's not great at it. It's always a little bit sketchy to defend with a character with something like 2 defense and 3 hit points. She's really not doing any attacking. You hit the nail right on the head when you said that this hero really pushes mono spirit, but she's not that great at it. For example, if you trigger her ability, one of the allies you might consider dumping into play is the Pelargir Shipwright, which has willpower equal to the number of heroes with a printed spirit resource icon you have in play. And since Caldara is gone, it's only going to be 2 willpower instead of 3. So something like Northern Tracker might let you clear out locations en masse, but we've really seen locations with more and more quest points as this game continues to go on. So there are some scenarios where this could be a really powerful effect, especially if you're playing some more classical stuff, but there aren't a lot of other great allies to target with this effect.
Yeah, I think, additionally, rereading her card text here, it's put 1 spirit ally from your discard pile into play. That almost adds insult to injury. It can't be a spirit ally in your hand. You can't search your deck for a spirit ally. The ally has to be in your discard pile. So you either need to play things that allow you to discard cards or do some chump blocking with allies that you hope to get back at a later time. It just seems a little bit weird. So again, it's an ally that I'm not opposed to trying, unlike others in the game, like Spirit Pippin, who I have tried now at this point, but I was really not intending to for most of the life of the game. And so I think she could be interesting, but it just seems so anti the purpose of the game to willingly discard a hero to get an ally or two from your discard pile. Whereas discarding Boromir to deal 2 damage to each enemy engaged with a single player seems like a much more even trade-off to me than her discard action.
Yeah. I think the appeal of her effect is that maybe you can save a lot of resources by discarding a hero in order to put allies into play, so you actually circumvent paying their cost. But the issue is, as soon as you lose that hero, she's not generating that one additional resource for you. So if the game ends up stretching on longer than you were anticipating, if you end up losing those allies, maybe you really struggle just because of the impaired resource generation. I think a natural complement to this card is Fortune or Fate, so that you can return her to play, but again, the issue there is that that's a 5-cost event, so that resource drain becomes even more significant. So maybe if there are multiple players running spirits, again, even though Gondor has lots of resource acceleration effects, if you're running mono spirit, you don't really have access to that, so it seems like Caldara is kind of a mishmash of a lot of different effects, and all in all, she just doesn't function that well. She's got the Gondor trait, but almost every Gondor synergistic card is outside of the spirit sphere. It's things like For Gondor and Gondorian Discipline, or Gondorian Shield. Apart from something like the neutral envoy of Pelargir, nothing really fits her perfectly. If you are using her in a defensive capacity, which, maybe 2 defense and 3 hit points for a spirit hero is alright, maybe it's about as good as you're gonna get, it is possible that you can put Blood of Numenor on her so that she can gain additional defense based on how many resources she has, but it just seems like you'd be investing so much into this one character that, really to get the most use out of her, you're supposed to discard, so it just seems counterintuitive to put any attachments on her in the first place.
I think my final thought on her is that sadly she doesn't work with Landroval. So this would have to be a situation that occurs in a multiplayer game, because Landroval is the tactics eagle from the A Journey to Rosgobel adventure pack, but Landroval's response reads after a hero card is destroyed, and that has been further clarified to sort of mean through combat damage or damage of some sort, maybe from a treachery, but damage tokens nonetheless. Caldara isn't being destroyed, she's being discarded, so sadly our eagle ally is not able to rescue her if you trigger her action.
A few final thoughts about this card are that one thing that might help you to get allies into your discard pile are digging through your deck with the Sigil Miner. Maybe that way you can generate some additional resources on your other spirit characters to save up for some expensive resurrection effect, but really the only other thing I can think of about this hero is that it really works against one of my favorite spirit allies, which is the extremely inexpensive Sylvan Refugee, just because if the stars align, you have those perfect allies in your discard pile. If you discard Caldara from play, every single copy of Sylvan Refugee on the table is going to be immediately discarded, so maybe it defeats the entire point of her ability in the first place. And lastly, before we move on, I'll just mention that one final convenient means of getting cards into your discard pile just might be Caldara's fellow spirit hero, Éowyn from the core set. So if it just so happens that you end up drawing those powerful allies, you don't want to expend the resources to get them into play, it's certainly always an option to trigger Éowyn's ability to boost up your willpower and also serve the purpose of getting those powerful ally cards into your discard pile, exactly where you want them if you're planning on triggering Caldara's ability. Certainly this is a hero to keep an eye on, but for the moment, I really don't see this character making an appearance in our series anytime soon. But the first of our leadership cards is the ally Squire of the Citadel, with a cost of 1, willpower of 0, attack of 0, defense of 1, and 1 hit point. It has the trait Gondor and response. After Squire of the Citadel leaves play, add 1 resource to a Gondor hero's resource pool. So, the first thing that jumps out about this character is its absolutely abysmal stat lineup. It can't do anything questing, it can't do anything attacking, unless you've got some sort of Gondor synergy going on. It's nice that that tiny drop of defense means that on occasion it might be able to survive an attack from something like an Eastern Crows, but by itself, this card seems strictly limited to chump blocking.
Yeah, I suppose he could throw 1 point at a siege quest, but you're right. He's obviously built for chump blocking. And what I like about him is that he adds a resource to any Gondor hero's resource pool. It doesn't have to be a Gondor hero that you control. So in a multiplayer game, if there's multiple decks that are running Gondor heroes and someone needs a resource, you can chump with this guy, give a resource over to your buddy. Of course, if you need the resource, you can keep it for yourself too. So he pays for himself, and he might be giving you a resource later on when you really need it. So if you're going to be building a Gondor deck, I think the Squire is a strong contender for an ally slot.
Like I pointed out, although this character might not seem like much at first, you're very welcome to mold it into pretty much whatever you want. So one of our Gondor heroes you're probably running, if you're playing a Gondor deck, is of course Boromir, who has an effect based on having resources in his pool. So maybe this is one way to make sure that Boromir is well stocked, and of course if you've got Boromir in play, then this character all of a sudden has 1 attack value. It basically pays for itself when you trigger that response and it dies, so it's effectively free. If you're running an effect like Horn of Gondor, it becomes better than free, so in a lot of ways this is almost an uber chump blocker. Other effects work fantastically with this card, just because it's such a cheap ally that you can dump on the table to count as a body toward any number of other effects, like Faramir from the core set, Sword That Was Broken, so if you've got both of those in play, all of a sudden it's contributing 2 or more willpower. Maybe you're running Hail of Stones, and this extremely inexpensive character is contributing to dealing some direct damage into the staging area, so there's certainly a lot of pluses to this character. You just want to be a little bit careful if you're running a big swarm of allies based on what encounter deck you're running up against, just because there are so many encounter cards and shadow effects that punish you for using chump blockers, like Uruk Soldier that we saw from Assault on Osgiliath. So if he's disposable, great. If you can buff him up, that's great too. But in any case, it's hard to say no to a cheap ally like this. Certainly this is going to be a character that gets all the more worth playing over time. If you've got effects like For Gondor, again, those work perfectly with a Swarm ally deck, and if you're running something like Citadel Custodian, this is 1 more Gondor character to reduce the cost of that other ally. So I like Squire of the Citadel, he's a nice basic dude, so I'm sure he's going to be seeing some play.
Up next is our leadership attachment, Tome of Atanitor, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It costs 4, it is a record, and it must attach to a leadership hero. You're able to reduce the cost to play the Tome of Atanitor by 1 for each hero you control with the printed leadership resource icon, and it has an action. Discard Tome of Atanitor to play any leadership event card in your discard pile as if it were in your hand. Then place that event on the bottom of your deck. So basically this is the third of the 4 sort of book or tome attachments, scrolls, the various things that all do the same thing for the different spheres. I'm not sure that I would have a ton of stuff to say here that we haven't said in our discussion of the previous 2 books, except to say that I think the prime candidate, or at least one of the top 3 candidates for this card, would be the ever trusty core set leadership event Sneak Attack. So you can abuse Gandalf even more than you may already be doing.
as I was so fond of saying with the Spirit and Tactics records, what I find so fascinating about this soon-to-be quartet of attachments is that provided you have lots of card draw, you have incredible luck, and you can shuffle your deck, or some combination of the three, it allows you to play one powerful leadership event up to 9 times in one game. So you can play the event 3 times, you can use this attachment 3 times, and then since it puts that event on the bottom of your deck, it's possible that you can cycle through, mix things up, draw it again, and play that event a nearly innumerable number of times. If you're running mono leadership, which is certainly the most resource-friendly way to play this card, it does add 1 to the cost of that event, but what I like so much about the leadership events is they're so cheap, and there's so many to pick from. I think my absolute favorite way to use this card would be with a very good tail. So if you've got allies to exhaust, maybe some of those really cheap Gondor characters, you can exhaust them, you can discard a bunch of cards, you can put even more cheap allies into play. And even though you're going to cycle through your deck pretty quickly with a very good tail, 1 or more copies of Tome of Atanitor, if you've got another player that can maybe help you out with something like Will of the West, I see this as being something that could potentially be pretty powerful. Another card I really like with this, particularly in a 3 or 4 player game, is Campfire Tales, just because for 2 resources, having every player draw a card can be a pretty potent effect. Leadership certainly has innumerable different cards for dwarves, for allies, to ready all characters in play, and another powerful option might be We're Not Idle, just so you can push maybe a mono leadership dwarf deck to its absolute limits by generating an enormous pile of resources. So I see this card as probably the strongest record so far. I think its potential for abuse is absolutely incredible, and I'm very excited to give this one a try.
Yeah, none of these record cards really appeal to me, but certainly I would agree that the tome here is probably the most powerful. And as we've noted in our discussions of the previous 2, you cannot use this attachment to get back cards that are a response. You have to pull back an event that is an action event. So that's also worth noting, because if you're hoping to get something that's a response, not going to work in this particular case.
So on to our tactics cards, the first of which is a unique ally with a very unique name. It is Guthloff. For a cost of 3, he has 1 willpower, 1 attack, 2 defense, and 2 hit points. It has the Rohan trait, which we haven't seen in a while, and if there is at least 1 Rohan hero in play, lower the cost to play Guthloff by 1. And if there is at least 1 Gondor hero in play, Guthloff gains Sentinel. So certainly there's a pretty wide spectrum of power for this card. Under ideal circumstances, he only costs 2. He's not a very powerful quester, but Tactics can really use all the willpower that it can get. He's not a particularly hard-hitting attacker, but if you're playing Tactics, you're probably not hurting for that.
Yeah, this is an interesting ally. I've been including him in some of my more recent decks because they've happened to contain both a Rohan and a Gondor hero, and certainly paying 2 for him is much better than playing 3, but I'm still not sure that he's all that great. He gets Sentinel if there's a Gondor hero in play, but his defense isn't all that great. I'm never going to turn my nose up at having a character with Sentinel. It's certainly always handy if you can defend for someone else, but again, he's probably not going to survive too many Sentinel attacks. The 1 willpower for 2 cost, I suppose, in Tactics isn't that bad. So again, I've used him, but he's not always the most exciting play. It's something, if I have nothing else to play, that I'll tend to play him on that particular turn. He's not an ally that I'm just really, really itching to get on the table unless we happen to be short on willpower. But even then, his 1 willpower isn't going to be adding that much. So, for me, he's a mixed card. If I happen to have a Rohan and a Gondor character in my hero mix, I'll throw him in. But otherwise, I don't think he's, super exciting.
I think some of the big limitations of this ally are, at the moment, Rohan heroes aren't particularly powerful, and 3 is an awful lot for a character like this. Even if you're fortunate enough to have a Gondor hero in play, which is a lot more likely since we only have 4 different Rohan heroes at this point, Tactics has, in my opinion, much better options for Sentinel defenders unless you're facing very, very weak enemies. You've got Watcher of the Brunnen, which would require you to discard cards or discard that ally. You've got Winged Guardian, which you either have to discard that ally or get rid of some resources, so maybe he serves a one-time chump blocker role for another player. I just don't see him being a very consistent defender. Like you pointed out, he's awfully squishy.
Yeah, the only thing that I think is perhaps interesting and worth pointing out is because I've always played him in decks where I am controlling a Rohan and a Gondor character, but it's not how his card is worded. It's just if there is at least one Rohan, or if there is at least one Gondor hero in play. So you don't actually have to control the Rohan or the Gondor hero. It can be anyone in your 2, 3, or 4 player game. So that certainly adds a little bit of flexibility. If you want to play a Gondor and someone else wants to play Rohan, well, then you're good. You can still get this guy. So certainly with the voice of Isengard coming out, perhaps we might get some Rohan tactics cards, or maybe even some more Gondor cards in general that could maybe somehow make this guy better. But again, I've used him in decks. I don't dislike him. It's always nice to have extra willpower and tactics. But again, he's just an ally that, for me, is mediocre. If we get better allies in the next cycle, which I'm sure we will, right, he'd probably be one of the first cards that gets cut out of a deck that I'm running.
I definitely have to agree. The fact that the Rohan synergy just isn't very developed at this point really holds him back. You've got effects like Astonishing Speed and Ailment, We Do Not Sleep, and of course there's Mutual Accord so that you can give a Rohan character Gondor synergy, but that's really pretty limited. All of those are one-time only effects, and they're pretty much centered around questing. So you've got all the combat Gondor stuff, but really Guthloff isn't a very stellar ally, and frankly, for 3 resources, I'm just much more likely to invest that elsewhere. Really, the only other thing I can think of to mention is that at the very least, there are 8 different Gondor heroes, so it's really easy to unlock that Sentinel ability, and remember that as soon as someone plays the ever-popular Steward of Gondor on a hero, then he gains Sentinel.
The second tactics card for this adventure pack is the event, the Hammer Stroke. It has a cost of 2, and it has an encounter action, which simply reads, engage each enemy in play. So interestingly, this is our first encounter action card, so it's limited to the engagement phase. It's not a card I've used, and I tend to think of this as a sort of a last-ditch effort card. I'm not sure that it would make a place in my decks consistently, because I can really see it being a dead card in my hand a lot of the time. As longtime viewers of the Progression series or listeners of the Great Company podcast know, I love playing tactics. It's my favorite sphere by far, so I'm always including sentinel defenders and ranged attackers, so I'm often able to defend for my buddies or even attack their enemies for them. I'm not sure why I would need, in sort of a general case situation, to engage each of the enemies myself. So I think it's a card that could certainly, in some situations, be very helpful and perhaps help you win the game, or at least prolong your losing. But again, it's not something that I think I would auto-include in my deck for the rest of time, hoping or counting on the fact that I might need to engage each enemy in play.
I can see this card in 2 different lights. In one way, it's a really high-risk, high-reward type card, And in the other way, it's something that allows you to maybe save another player. So maybe the non-combat player is getting bogged down by enemies. Maybe it just so happens that even though you're playing tactics, you don't have sufficient ranged or sentinel characters on the board to save them, or maybe for whatever reason that wouldn't work out too well. This is a pretty messy effect in that you have to engage every single enemy in play, but at the same time it allows for some extremely enticing possibilities. One of the natural combos with this card, if you're playing mono tactics, is Thicket of Spears. So even though you might be engaging countless numbers of enemies, you can deny all of them the opportunity to attack. And if you can take advantage of enough tricky card effects like Rain of Arrows, Tactics Boromir, whether it's just him attacking every enemy with or without Gondorian fire, maybe even discarding him as a last-ditch finishing blow, I think this card has the potential to be incredible, but it also has equal potential to absolutely ruin that one player if they're not able to deal with all of those enemies that are suddenly engaged with them.
Yeah, I think that this is one of those types of cards that perhaps gets better in multiplayer games. Certainly in a solo game, I can't see this card being of much use at all. You're flipping over one encounter card a turn, barring Surge, of course. In two-player games, a little bit more. 3 and 4, obviously flipping 4 encounter cards. So perhaps in quests where you have to flip over more encounter cards than the number of players on certain quest cards, or, there's quests where the first goblin enemy gains Surge, so you have the potential to reveal a whole bunch, that this could perhaps be helpful so one player can take all of those enemies. But again, most quests don't have situations like that. Most games I play, I'm not dealing with a horde of enemies, and even if we were, could I, as a tactics player, handle all of them anyway? So I think it's an interesting card. I don't think it's a bad card. But again, I don't really like to have niche situational cards in my deck. I tend to prefer more general purpose things that will get me out of the fire and have sort of a more proactive board state. And this is a more reactive sort of card, and that's typically not my playstyle.
This definitely does strike me as a little bit gimmicky. I'm thinking of maybe something like Nightmare Conflict at the Carrack, where you have a ton of really, really powerful enemies in play, and maybe there's other quests where you can have multiple players construct decks so that if you can count on one player having all the enemies engaged with him, maybe they can all pour some sort of area of effect damage into those enemies and end up dispatching them. So maybe this will allow you to kind of cheese your way through certain scenarios. Maybe it will serve as a convenient rescue effect, and maybe, who knows, you'll use it to do something like pull a goblin archer out of the staging area or something like that. So this card definitely has uses. By no means are you going to see this in every tactics deck, so I'm curious to see what players come up with. Something that might work with this is the spirit event Light the Beacons, so even though that is expensive, even though you're probably going to have to rely on another player to play that card, if you've got one powerful defending character, since you don't have to exhaust, you can defend a countless number of times. And if your defense value's high enough, you might not have much to worry about. But in that kind of situation, if you're playing someone like Baragond, probably one of the most popular tactics heroes, then it almost works against the point of Hammerstroke in the first place, just because he is a powerful Sentinel defender. So there's pros to this card, there's some cons. I think it can definitely be a pretty steep resource investment, just considering you need so many other cards to make this work, but there's definitely situations where this can be just incredible. But onward to our spirit cards, the first of which is another unique ally, Emery. For a cost of 3, she has 1 willpower, 1 attack, 2 defense, and 2 hit points. It's yet another Gondor trait character. And action. Discard the top 3 cards of your deck to put Emery into play from your hand under any player's control. Then, if any of the discarded cards have the tactics, lore, or leadership sphere, discard Emery. So, this is another Gondor ally that's not spectacular by itself, but as we've covered, there's certainly plenty of Gondor synergy available, and there's a little bit more to come as we get to our final adventure pack in the Against the Shadow cycle. So, even though Emery's not doing a lot by herself, you can definitely mold her a little bit, and if you're running Mono Spirit, God forbid Caldara might be one of your heroes you're running, it's never a bad thing to dump allies into play for free.
Right, I certainly think she could be a decent siege quester with her 2 defense strength. And also, you mentioned Caldara. I think she combos nicely with Caldara. In other words, Caldara's ability is dependent on having allies in the discard pile. So since Emery has to discard the top 3 cards of your deck, hopefully, maybe, those 3 cards will be other allies that Caldara could then trigger her action to bring into play as well. So I think if you're running Caldara, you're definitely going to want Emery in your deck as a way to make sure you're discarding some cards.
I definitely agree, and really the only other thing I can think of to mention is that beyond being free, it's pretty cool that you can put her into play under the control of any player. So even though she doesn't have Sentinel, it's more or less the same thing, with a few added benefits. So maybe you're playing a chump blocker for another player, maybe it's someone else that has more allies than you, and they're the one running Aragorn with Sword That Was Broken, or some sort of effect like that. So it's certainly easy to buff up her attack power with things like For Gondor and Boromir. Maybe you can do a little bit of something with her defense strength with, again, For Gondor, or maybe something like Behind Strong Walls. But, by herself, for a cost of 3, she's a fairly bland ally. If you are worried about discarded cards and you're not running Caldara, maybe you can do Dwarven Tomb, Map of Earnil, Will of the West. So Spirit certainly has a lot of options to kind of work around her weakness or strength, however you want to see it. So this is an interesting character. It's definitely nothing to write home about. I don't think anybody's gonna pick this card out of the pack and say, oh, this is, my favorite ally from the Blood of Gondor, but she's got uses. What else can I say?
Yeah, I'll just sort of echo what you said. I think it's really cool that you can play her under any player's control, and I think I would love to see this on allies from other spheres and just more in general, especially if they can find creative ways or reasons as to why you would do that or something. So there's pretty much at this point we can only play attachments on other players' characters. We could certainly play events that would maybe impact other players, but at this point, there's really not a whole lot of ways to transfer allies. I don't believe there are any, except for Emery, and so I think that that's pretty neat, and I'd certainly, again, love to see more of it.
A couple final things to keep in mind about Emery are that her ability does not specify that it needs to be a planning action. So unlike the conventional means of putting an ally into play, you're not limited to any one particular phase to put her onto the table. Another thought is that by triggering her action, you actually have her interplay prior to determining whether or not she needs to be discarded. And in that way, if somebody's running Prince Imrahil, she effectively functions as a cram attachment, a zero-cost means of readying him in some sort of emergency. And similarly, provided that a hero has an attached Horn of Gondor, Putting Emery into play only for her to be subsequently discarded can function as something of a somewhat more flexible Wealth of Gondor, so for no resource investment whatsoever, you're ending up with a net gain of 1 resource token. And even though she's a unique character, restricted to only having 1 copy of her in play at a time, if you're using her in a defensive role, whether for yourself or for another player, if it just so happens that she's killed in the middle of the combat phase, you're certainly welcome between the 4 different steps of enemy attack resolution to trigger her ability, and, provided that she stays in play, she can potentially do multiple defenses each combat, provided that you're willing to lose that ally to chump blocking. So, certainly an interesting, flexible character. She might not seem like much on first glance, but there's certainly more to this ally than meets the eye, and, just like so many other cards, I'm dead curious as to what other kinds of powerful, synergistic effects are going to work well with this ally over time.
Alright, the final spirit card of this adventure pack is a 0-cost event, Children of the Sea. Its action reads, choose a Sylvan or Noldor ally you control. That ally gets +2 willpower until the end of the phase. At the end of the phase, shuffle that ally into its owner's deck if it is still in play. Much like the Morgul Vale has hint of Rohan coming up that we might see in the voice of Isengard in its attached Ringmaker cycle, I can't help but wonder if this is also, in a way, a preview card, given the spoiler articles we've seen for our upcoming cycle with the elves and their interplay abilities. This is a way to sort of get them out, back in your deck, and interplay. As it is, with the current game state, I don't think there are a ton of Sylvan or Noldor allies that I would want to discard. A lot of them are either really expensive, the Gildor and Glorians, the Haldirs, their Arrestors, or they have abilities that you need them on the table that you want them for. Daughter of the Nimrodel, for example, to heal your heroes. So one of the allies that sort of jumped out at me was the Rivendell Minstrel, because she does have a when enters play effect. You can search for a song, so perhaps she would be a decent candidate for this. So it's an interesting card. I'm not sure it's fantastic at this point in the game, but again, given what we've seen of what's coming up in the next few months, I think this card could just get better and better.
There's definitely some things to like about this card, there's definitely some things not to like. I think the biggest limitation to this at the moment is, just like you point out, even though we've been teased some Sylvan and Noldor characters that have those enter and exit play effects, they're not really in the game at the moment. So I love that this is free, I love that you can play multiple copies on one character, so if you give one elf +6 willpower, it seems much more worthwhile to send that back to your deck and to have to repay that casting cost at some point in the future. It does work against the Sylvan Refugee that I mentioned earlier, but unless you've got multiple copies of that character in play, maybe that's what you target with this card, so when it re-enters your deck and leaves play, its ability doesn't really penalize you any further because it's already leaving play. And in that case, even though it's 2 cards, it strikes me as about the same as an Escort from Aedoras, where you've got 4 willpower, and then it leaves play at the end of the quest phase. I like that players have the option where prior to quest resolution, but after staging, they can choose to play this event, so maybe you don't want to play it on your powerful or expensive Sylvan or Noldor ally, but maybe it's what you need to push past that nasty location or finish the current quest card, so I think this is certainly okay if you've got effects like Horn of Gondor, Valiant Sacrifice, maybe Prince Imrahil. Characters leaving play work to your benefit, so I think this is a pretty interesting card. I think it's going to get a hell of a lot better in the very near future, and like several of these cards, I'm excited to see what players end up doing with this. Well, to round things out, let's cover our final sphere, which is lore, and we have yet another unique ally in Anborn, which, for a cost of 4, has 1 willpower, 3 attack, 1 defense, and 3 hit points. It has traits Gondor and Ranger, and reads Action, exhaust Anborn to return 1 trap card from your discard pile to your hand. So, right off the bat, I can't help but notice that this Gondor ally, if you have Boromir in play, which this is supposed to be the Gondor cycle, has an incredible 4 attack. So for a lore ally, he hits like an absolute truck. He's great in that regard for battle questing. He's very resilient with those 3 hit points. He's not really doing a lot normal questing wise or defense wise. But as this cycle wraps up, it just seems like more and more lore is just becoming this Tactics 2.0 attack powerhouse.
Yeah, this is a card that I have experimented with, and certainly I've played with my buddies and they've used Anborn. Most of the time, his ability isn't being used. He's being used for that 3 attack strength, right? And Lore doesn't really have a whole lot of great attackers, as you mentioned, Mitch, so he certainly shines there. His other uses, though, have been things like throwing a ranger bow on him for some direct damage on enemies, or there's that nasty location Overgrown Trail with lots of threat, lots of quest points where you can exhaust some ranger characters to play some progress on it. I've seen him used more in sort of non-conventional ways, I suppose, than for his actual printed action. With that said, if you are having a lot of traps leave play, certainly the Ranger Spikes is one of my favorite, although that one might not be leaving play, but we have Forest Snare from the core set. We're going to be discussing one in a moment. If you do have traps entering and leaving play, certainly Anborn is a way to bring those back, and even if you don't use his action a lot, I do think his stats can compensate for his 4 cost.
In some ways, this character reminds me of Gildor Inglorian, just because it's a very expensive lore character that has incredible stats, but the effect is kind of hit and miss. Like, would you rather be attacking for 3 or 4, maybe even 5 if you've got 4 Gondor to help you out, or do you want to return a trap card from your discard pile to your hand? So maybe you've got leftover actions at the end of the round where you can just trigger that ability. You pointed out that some of our traps aren't really designed to leave play, like Ranger Spikes, generally that enemy's pinned in the staging area. Forest Snare, generally that enemy's sitting there in front of you. But at the same time, if you can, it's a good idea to kill off those enemies, just because who knows when you're gonna pull a shadow effect that's discard all attachments you control, and then all of a sudden your 3 forest snared enemies are attacking you all over again. So I absolutely love him with the trap that we're about to cover, but apart from that, I definitely see him as more of a character to use for his attributes than his ability. Really, the only other thing I can think of to mention about this character is that since he's a Gondor ally, I feel like there's a pretty strong probability you might be running leadership, and that means tons of resource acceleration, so that hefty cost of 4 resources might just seem like a drop in the bucket if you can count on that synergy working in your favor.
Our final lore card of this adventure pack is the 2-cost attachment Poisoned Stakes. It is itself a trap, and you play Poison Stakes into the staging area unattached. If unattached, attach Poison Stakes to the next eligible enemy that enters the staging area. At the end of each round, deal 2 damage to the attached enemy. I think that this could potentially be my least favorite of the traps. Certainly, Forest Snare is a core set standby. Ranger Spikes is perhaps my favorite because not only does it pin an enemy in the staging area, it also reduces their threat. Poison Stakes, on the other hand, the enemy can still potentially engage you, you still have to defend that attack, you still may need to attack back, and the 2 damage to the attached enemy might be enough to kill it in 1 turn, but it might not. Enemies are getting beefier and beefier, and Poison Stakes by itself might not do the job. But if you can get some attack power in, maybe just enough that then the 2 damage at the end of the round will be enough to kill it. But I guess what I'm saying here is what I don't like, unlike Ranger Spikes, is that you do actually have to defend against this particular enemy, which may or may not be a bad thing, certainly, but I would sort of prefer to actually trap an enemy in the staging area or with Force Snare than to have to deal with defending him. And will this 2 damage be enough, or will it not?
I definitely think there are situations where this card just seems perfect, but there are also a lot of situations where it doesn't do you a lot of good. Like you pointed out, if it sticks to an enemy that has a ton of hit points, even though it's basically that enemy's life total is ticking away, where at some point it's pretty much guaranteed to get killed so long as this attachment stays stuck to it, you might have to deal with a hell of a lot in the meantime. So maybe it's attacking like an absolute truck, round after round. Maybe you're risking some sort of horrible shadow effect triggering. And in a case like that, it probably is going to seem like you're wasting a card and you're wasting 2 resources to even bother putting this into play. So I really like that it bypasses defense. Certainly, like you mentioned, it works great with other direct damage effects. We've seen the card Forest Patrol previously, where for any enemy with a trap stuck to it, you can deal an immediate 3 damage. So maybe that combination of effects helps you to whittle down that big enemy faster. Maybe it spares you actions and that you can just have one character defend, and then instead of having to waste actions attacking, you can just let the enemy die at the end of the round. This certainly can be good, it can be terrible. If you've got Anborn, this is certainly a good contender to return to your hand because this is definitely going to show up in your discard pile, but I can't help but think this is going to be pretty scenario specific as to whether or not you want to use this.
Yeah, it's certainly a fun card, and I think the fun factor, well, is fun. Having damage on enemies every round is super cool. So, comboed with Ranger Bow, which would be natural for a lore deck, and certainly with Anborn, you could be doing perhaps 3 points of direct damage, which may be enough to take down some enemies. So, if you're going to build a Ranger deck, you're going to build a trap deck, I see no reason not to include this card. But if you're just sort of maybe splashing lore or whatever else, I would think perhaps some of the other traps might be more worthwhile.
I think this card really highlights one of the problems with the Lord of the Rings living card game, which is that there's stuff that works and there's stuff that's fun, but it doesn't work quite as well, or maybe it's a little bit less consistent. So sometimes people point out that in our videos we use the same heroes again and again, and it's because they work. Maybe we avoid a card like this just because it's easier to spend 2 resources on an ally that you know is going to be able to hit for 2 or maybe more, or maybe you're just investing in some sort of other attachment. So this is certainly a fun, flavorful card, but whether it's really going to be effective can definitely be hit and miss. If you're running up against a scenario like the Druidan Forest, maybe you kill a really low hit point enemy, but maybe this is stuck to a Druidan Drummer, where all the Wozes in the staging area are getting plus to their threat until the end of the round. Or maybe it's a 7 archery valued Druidan whatever that you have to deal with during the combat phase. So I'm curious to see how this one will work out. Certainly in some of the Dwarodelf quests, Khazad-dûm, there are a ton of 2 hit point enemies where this could be pretty cool, but at the same time, in scenarios like that, if enemies are allowed 1 attack, maybe that's all they need to replace themselves. So I like this card a lot conceptually, but I'm just not sure about actually playing it. Really, the last thing I can think of to mention about this card, and really any trap, is that they can all trigger on the same target, so you want to be pretty careful with how you're managing those. Like Poison Stakes and Ranger Spikes might go off on the same target and end up being a waste. Maybe it's going to work out in your favor if there's attachment discard effects that you have to worry about, but maybe you might end up wasting resources. Maybe you don't have return trap to your hand abilities to rely on, so All in all, this is definitely a card to think carefully about before putting it in your deck. One absolute final thought for players that are determined to get Poison Stakes to function is that it might be worth considering an old lore event, Infighting from A Journey to Rosgobel, specifically in case your attachment happens to trigger on a less than ideal target. So whether they've got more hit points than you can manage, or something occurs where you decide that enemy needs to leave play far faster than a single copy of Poison Stakes can manage, if it has pre-existing damage counters from Poison Stakes, from other attacks, whatever the source happens to be, if it just so happens that you have a surplus of attack strength available, being able to reassign some of those damage tokens, ideally to take out a much squishier and desirable target, then Infighting actually might end up being a pretty decent play. So our final player card for the Blood of Gondor is the neutral event Well Equipped, which, for a cost of 0, reads Action. Discard the top 2 cards of your deck. You may attach one attachment card discarded by this effect to an eligible dwarf character in play. So, it seems like the Against the Shadow designers haven't forgotten about the dwarves, even though it's been a little while since they've seen some love. I like that this is free, but it's one of those inconsistent cards. So unless you've got some sort of scrying effect to rely on, there's a chance that this is going to hit and it'll save you 2 or more resources, but there's also a chance that this is going to whiff, and then you've effectively wasted a card.
Yeah, I think a lot of players were surprised to see a dwarf card in this pack, and spoiler alert, a dwarf in the next pack, but I wouldn't be surprised if every trait in every cycle gets at least 1 or 2 cards. So, I suppose it's a welcome addition. I think my thoughts largely mirror yours. I think the top contender, of course, would be a Citadel plate on Gimli, or perhaps even Glowin. This would allow you to potentially have cards of a sphere that your heroes don't match, and you'd still have a way to play them, but I do dislike the fact that it's the top 2 cards of your deck. I wish it was perhaps the top 5, which would be discarding a lot, or maybe top 3, but it would certainly increase your chance of getting attachments. Since dwarves, as you sort of mentioned, don't have any natural scrying ability, you'd have to put in cards like the Enladra Stargazer, which then breaks theme a little bit, but I don't dislike the card. I haven't been playing dwarf decks in quite a while. I can't see that Well Equipped makes me want to run and bust out my old dwarf decks just so I can include it. I just think the top 2 cards in a traditional sort of dwarf deck are normally going to whiff and probably not be an attachment, and therefore this card probably isn't ever going to make it into a dwarf deck, should I make one in the future.
I do think that one of the things working in this card's favor is that dwarf decks generally are very attachment heavy. So you mentioned an armor attachment. We've also got ringmail, we have boots from Erebor. We've got things like Dwarodelf Axe and Dwarven Axe, and of course Legacy of Durin, Steward of Gondor, King Under the Mountain. All sorts of different things, nearly countless options. We even talked about the Tome of Atanitor earlier in this video, which mono-leadership dwarves is pretty popular, and this fits in pretty well with that. I generally don't think it's a big deal to discard cards off the top of your deck, so if you've got a lot of card draw, that's really not a big deal. We've already mentioned a host of different effects where if you're really concerned about running out of cards, you can recycle your deck, or maybe another player can recycle your deck. Maybe you're running Caldara, and this is another way of getting cards into your discard pile. So there's certainly the potential for this card to be a pretty good savings, but you've really got to play the odds with this one, so I'd say break down the probability of drawing an attachment when you play this deck. Have you already gotten a lot of your uniques in play? So is this going to, even if it hits, end up being a waste of cards? So this is interesting. We're going to end up seeing some things that make it a little bit better in the near future. There are some existing dwarves that work well with having cards in your discard pile, like if it just so happens that you get 2 attachments and you have to discard 1. Erebor Hammersmith is a very powerful, popular dwarf ally, so maybe that allows you to put another card in your hand. So I see potential in well-equipped, but is it going to fit into every deck? Like so many cards in this pack, I definitely don't think so, and really the only other thing I can think of to mention is that since dwarves might already be running Bofur to dig for attachments, he kinda works against this card, just because if you're pulling attachments out of your deck, even though that does help you, you're nevertheless decreasing the probability of this card hitting. But for the first time in a very long time, we've come to the end of our adventure pack, so Matthew, any overall thoughts about all of these player cards?
This is an interesting adventure pack to be sure. The Heroes one I'll keep my eye on, but in the short term, I don't see myself constructing decks with her very often. I think, to me, the best cards of the pack are perhaps the allies. Squire of the Citadel, to me, is perhaps the strongest card, or at least the most versatile and most likely to make it into my decks. I've used Guthlaf before. Again, he's not stellar. It was just, it's a new card, I can throw him in. He's not really lowering the power of my deck all that much. Emery is certainly a good addition to a Caldara deck. Anborn, I think, is good, even if you're not returning traps. So I like the allies. The other cards, I'm less enthused about. Of course, the Tome of Atanitor would be fantastic, I think. Just the tomes, or the records, I should say, are not my favorite cards in general. So all in all, if you're a new player, I don't think this should be the first adventure pack you run out and purchase. It's not really going to help your core set expand or make your decks much better. I'm not even sure if you're an experienced player, if this is going to be a pack that's just going to really make you want to either build new types of decks or replace some perhaps driftwood in your existing deck, cards that just aren't maybe pulling their weight. So yeah, it's an underwhelming pack for me by and large, with a few highlights that can fit into maybe some niche decks.
I certainly have to agree with you on this one. I remember, just like you pointed out at Gen Con, seeing this Caldara, another FFG created hero, and just being a little bit confused, initially thinking she could put 3 allies into play, which would be a hell of a lot stronger, and then being pretty disappointed when it just seems like a very confusing, underwhelming ability all in all. And even though I think her art is fantastic, it's a fairly underwhelming card. I think there are some pretty interesting things in this pack. There's some kind of gimmicky stuff like the hammer stroke. I love the potential for Anborn to just absolutely devastate enemies. I love that Lore is getting more and more combat savvy. Poison Stakes struck me as a very cool card at first, but it seems the more I look at it, the more we talk about it, the less and less favorable it seems. Like I mentioned, I think of all the records we've seen so far, Tome of Atanitor is definitely the strongest, maybe bordering on broken, although I have been gone for the game for quite some time, so maybe it didn't end up being as good as I thought it might be when it was first spoiled in some preview articles. So a lot of our unique characters are a little bit underwhelming. The dwarf stuff, I can basically leave, but I have to agree, I think the Squire is very versatile, it's better than free in a lot of situations, and it sounds pretty silly to be excited about a character that has a grand total of 2 stat points and not a lot else going for it, but I suppose that's the Blood of Gondor, so I'd just like to close by thanking you all for checking out yet another entry in the LOTR LCG progression series. Once again, it's great to be back. You can expect much more to come from Matthew and I, so feel free to let us know in the comments below if you've thought of any clever uses or gimmick uses for some of these cards that we haven't thought of, if you've got different opinions than we do. As always, a like and subscribe are always appreciated. But with that said, we'll see you again soon.